Have you ever asked, how did my emotional heart form the way it did? So appreciate you listening to the Parable Podcast. And if this is your first time, welcome. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk. Joining me today is Senior Director of Strategic Operations for 10 by 10, Lisette Fraser. And she shares how one moment from summer camp changed her perspective on justice.
So I think there's something always in me that always has this hard moment when I feel like somebody doesn't want me. And yet, right? Like there was this and yet, but what do I want to be a part of? And there's this kingdom thing that is so much more beautiful and never makes you feel that way on purpose, for sure.
Here's my conversation with Lisette Fraser. I am so excited to introduce you to Lisette. Lisette was someone I met a couple years ago at a speakers boot camp. And so first, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
But Lisette, I think I might have told you this before. We were doing an exercise where we got up onto this box and we just kind of had to like do an impromptu message, which for me instills such great fear. Like I am a person that writes out every single word when I'm giving a message. And you got up there and you just like went off and it was amazing. And I'm like such energy and life and encouragement and truth. And I'm just like, okay, well, I'll go next.
Well, that's not how it felt to me, so thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I am thrilled to have this conversation with you. You are a leader, you're a coach, you're a consultant, you have done so much in ministry. But a fun fact that I found out while I was looking through your bio, you were born in the Netherlands. Right?
So true. Sure was.
So I'd love to know, what is the most Dutch thing about you?
I mean, it is still my first language, so it flies out of my mouth when necessary. This is really true. My children only know certain words because those are the ones that were used the most, probably in reference to them. The one they will always talk about is eigenwijs, which is kind of like stubborn, but it has its own flair. And because it sounds like you're spitting at someone while you're saying it, it's really helpful. I love black licorice, so that's a very Dutch thing about me.
Okay.
And I only make Dutch pancakes. I just don't want the other kind.
No, I do love a Dutch baby. Is that the same as Dutch pancakes, Dutch baby pancakes? Or
well, see, that's a whole other thing. So like we could get on this. People will call them crepes, but they're not. But they're really big, really thin. Yes. I don't know if that's what you refer to as a Dutch baby. Okay, because there are little tiny Dutch pancakes called poffertjes. That's a whole other thing.
Welcome to this Food Network.
You like to discuss about my Dutchness. Here we are.
No, that's great. I love to know those things. Have you been to the Netherlands since you left as a child?
Yes. We used to go every other summer for like multiple months because we are the only part of our family that immigrated to Canada first. And then now we're in the U.S. So the last time I went was a few years ago. And it was the first time my kids had ever gone. And it was the first time they met anybody I was ever related to. And they thought it was the coolest thing on the planet. It was super fun. Other than everybody's blonde and blue-eyed and I am not.
Well, your husband, Kyle, and your kids, you guys live in California. What is your favorite thing about being in the California area?
Oh, it's palm trees and sunshine. Mm-hmm. And honestly, if I could go to the beach every day, I would. I can't.
Yeah.
And we're a little far to do that every day, but in the summer, we'll go every week for sure.
Yeah. I feel like you recently bought a home. There's some renovations that are happening. Is it?
Yes.
They're continuing or have they completed?
Will they ever complete is maybe the better question, Danielle. Yes, we had to buy a complete fix. We didn't have to. We chose to buy a complete fixer-upper and had to gut the whole thing. We have a lot of things done, but say like baseboards or trim around windows, not so much. Okay. And today my husband decided to take apart another bathroom. So that is, if you hear anything, that's what's happening.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So my husband and I, our big project was our basement last summer. And I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a handy person, but I like to learn. You and your husband, if he's working in the bathroom, he seems like a handy person. How would you rate yourself compared to his?
I would rate myself on a high opinion scale. I'm great at opinions. I'm relatively solution oriented. Yeah. What I'm not is super handy. I'm like crafty. I can paint things.
Oh gosh, there were so many things I learned, as I'm sure that you guys have learned, as you're like, yeah, this isn't going to be a big deal.
I feel like that's the constant statement. And you watch these dumb makeover shows, and I should call them dumb because I love them, but they always get it done in 30 minutes. We know it's been months, but it doesn't feel that way. So it shouldn't feel that way in my house. Here we are.
What was your first job that you ever had?
My first job was at Sunnyside Garden Center in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And I swept a lot and moved a lot of plants.
What a lovely name, Sunnyside Garden Center.
Yeah, you know? And much to my mother's chagrin, the shirts we had to wear said gardeners make better lovers. And let me tell you, as a 16-year-old, I don't think she was so thrilled that I was wearing that, but it's fine. That was what we all wore.
You question who was in charge of that decision, you know?
100%.
Oh my gosh. All right. So I know you spent a ton of time in the youth space, college space, family ministry. Why that area of ministry for you?
I mean, I've always loved, I think I loved that age, even when I was that age, if that makes sense. Like, as soon as I was in high school, I was working with middle schoolers. It just mattered to me. But on a really personal level, those years were really tough. I had a lot of complicated family pieces. And for me, the church and youth ministry space was my safest space. And so because it was that for me, I wanted it to be that for other people.
You are the Senior Director of Strategic Operations at 10x10. Can you tell us, like, what does that mean?
Number one, we joke about my title because I don't know what it means. It's fine. So I can explain that. But what 10x10 is, which is also pretty funny, is that in the United States of America, currently, there are 1 million young people walking away from faith every year. And so this was like a dream, an approach, and an audacious prayer to see if we could help 10 million young people turn towards Jesus over the next 10 years and see if we could help stem the tide of that significant drift. That's what we're trying to do.
Earlier, you just said youth ministry for you was a safe space. What do you think has been the hardest challenge for youth not finding that space for themselves that's safe and possibly authentic?
I think our current climate is so challenging. I think the church is in the news more for how it's unsafe, whether that's because of lack of integrity and misconduct, whether it's because of alignment with political ideologies, whether it is any number of things. Their stance on just really strong stance on issues that reflect more a heart of dissatisfaction and lack of kindness versus love and kindness. And I think all those things just rub against a generation in the wrong direction. And what it looks like to them is that the church is irrelevant. It lacks compassion and kindness. So there's just a lot there. A young person to be willing to give it another shot when what they see feels like it's so not made or intended for them.
Lisette, you said you had 2 kids. How old are your kids right now?
They are 21 and 23.
So
they're real adults.
Yeah, you've gone through that season of walking them through junior high, high school, a lot of, I'm sure, emotions, big feelings. Eric and I have a 11-year-old and a 14-year-old right now. So we are journeying through. It's great, but it's just okay, I'm going to get it. I'm going to do it again.
Yes.
How has just being a mom shaped your heart for ministry? It's one thing to say I needed a safe space growing up, but now to witness that as a parent and impart that into this next generation.
It's one thing to love kids and journey with them through hard things. It's a whole other thing when it's your own. My husband and I, the amount of times we've looked at each other and gone, gosh, I had such a good answer when this was a parent asking me this question as a youth pastor versus I think you just realize the ins and outs. You realize, man, how much happens on the day-to-day and the hour-to-hour, the things they have to wrestle with and see and experience, the journeys they go on, and then the impact of whether the church feels like it's there or not, whether it feels like people of faith are there or not, what their journey with God is, and just watching the ebb and flow of that. And as much as ours ebbs and flows, it feels so much more, I don't know if it's costly as you watch your own kids ebb and flow, So it's a wild ride.
Absolutely.
That's what I've got. I think it's wildly increased my compassion and empathy. And it has certainly made me realize I don't know very much.
Now, do your kids still live at home with you guys, or are you and Kyle empty nesters?
Listen, we keep joking that we're revolving door nesters is what we are. So we were empty nesters. Our youngest is at school in Canada at college. Our daughter graduated almost 2 years ago now and was living on the East Coast. So we really were just like out here so far from our children, which was so sad. But our daughter's home for a couple months, which is lovely. She's leaving soon, but it's fine. And then our son's coming home for the summer. And I'm just like, well, here we are. So it feels like we just keep joking. We're like, one day we'll fully be empty nesters, but I'd keep him home as long as I could.
Well, Lisette, this podcast is a place where stories are shared. And I just think that is really where I connect the most with people. I'll listen to anyone who's ready to tell me a story. My husband always jokes. He's just like, how did you get that person to share that? And I'm like, well, I just asked. So I'd love to ask you, Lisette, what is your parable story that you'd like to share with us today?
I love this question. And I had so much fun going to listen to other podcast episodes and just curious about people's stories and how it shapes them. And I wrestled so much with what story do you share? Because there's so many that shape us and so many things that shape us. But it's funny. I feel like one of the questions I've gotten recently, quite a few times, sorry, I'm going to get to the story, my windy road to a story, has just been like, why did my heart form the way it did for justice? And so I've really been thinking about what are the stories that shaped me and why my heart beats the way it does. I think one of the things that shaped me over the years was the amount of young people I was around who were differently abled. And that was just a consistent part of youth group and school to me. And I think because I often felt like I didn't belong to places, it was important for me to help other people feel like they belonged to places. So there was one fellow youth group member, his name was Tommy, and Tommy had Down syndrome. And I loved hanging out with Tommy. And so Tommy and I were always friends at youth group. I would always see him on Sundays, be sure to include him. And it was always fun to see him. There was just this joy about him and just enjoyed him, felt like a friend to me. And so we had convinced our youth pastor that he should come to summer camp with us, which felt like the funnest. And so we were all thrilled to have him there. But somehow the boys in his cabin convinced him that I must have a crush on him. And so therefore he needed to have a crush on me. And he did not know how to manage that well. And it was uncomfortable. And the choice the leaders made was to send him home from camp. And that has bothered me to this day, because why didn't the boys who created this environment get sent home from camp? And Tommy was so sad. And I remember seeing those tears. And I remember just thinking oh my gosh, is this my fault? And feeling so in some way complicit or responsible or whatever. And then also just being 16 and not knowing what the heck to do with it. Yeah. But I feel like that has shaped so much of my desire for actual inclusion of people and this bent of, for gosh sake, can we hold the right people accountable for the behavior we see in the world? And the answer is no, we don't seem to do either of those things. We don't include and love well, and we don't hold the right people responsible. And so I think that feels like this constant refrain for me is, why are we not willing to include the people that need to be included? Is that not the way of the kingdom? And then why the junk are we willing to consistently bow to?
Well, this hits home because we recently had a situation at our daughter's school where she had to kind of confront somebody else to say hey, you can't do that. She has such a heart for the special needs kids at school. And just she is fiercely protective of them, which everyone should be. Gosh, just the word, you said, inclusion, love well, and just be kind. Sometimes I know we live in a broken world, but I'm how hard is that? So I love the initial question of as you were reflecting on your life, how did your heart form the way for justice? That's so good. When some people hear the word justice, they like immediately go to one thing. But can you explain like what justice means to you from the perspective of faith?
I mean, to me, I so deeply believe that who Jesus was and how he lived was actually such that he looked at every single person and saw them genuinely as created in his image, to be loved and to be cared for. And if you read the journey in the life of Jesus, to me, his eyes always drifted to the margins, right? It was always looking for the person who wasn't included, the person who wasn't naturally accepted, the person who wasn't naturally seen. And that was who he intentionally saw. And so to me, part of our hearts being shaped as people of faith for justice means we choose to let our eyes do the same thing. And in fact, not just choose, we intentionally ask our eyes to do the same thing. How do we look to see where the people who are marginalized, oppressed, missing, not included, how do you invite them in and make space for them?
I felt for you when you said your 16-year-old self, when Tommy had to leave and you asked yourself, like, is this my fault? Am I responsible? And I think it's twofold. One, I hope that you know that that wasn't the truth. Like you've recognized that now. Yeah. It wasn't your fault. But secondly, asking ourselves the question, like, what can we do to be aware or have these eyes of justice moving forward? And how can we be more responsible? It's not like, oh, like, look at what you've done in the past, like, but how can we change? How can we grow from these certain situations? What would be your encouragement for someone choosing to be like, okay, I need to move on and take responsibility for myself or other people around me?
I mean, I think it's so funny. I'm not a huge Dr. Phil person, but I remember him saying, like, you did the best you could with what you knew, but now that you know better, do better kind of idea. I think that's so much of our journey, right? Is to be able to have grace to say, I didn't know better. As my 16-year-old self, I didn't know to actually go fight and say, I think we're sending the wrong person home. I think we're actually, the consequences are falling in the wrong direction. I didn't know to say that, but I do know how to say that now. And so I try to do better now. And I try to say, like, wait, but the consequences are falling the wrong direction. Wait, it costs us something to make room for everyone. It does. It means we all seemingly lose something, but we gain so much more. So are we willing to make room? Are we willing to just be better?
What was your relationship like with Tommy after that? Did Tommy dwell on that moment, or was he able to move on? What was his journey like?
He was so embarrassed. It was really hard on his mom. It was a thing. And it just felt like every Sunday, it took a little time for it to feel comfortable, which made me sad. Yeah. What's crazy is, because I was reflecting, obviously, I was like in full story mode as I was thinking about this. So the guys who did this, there was 3 of them. I grew up with them. We all were friends for years and years and years. And so I was so disappointed with them being so stupid and so really mean. Like, to me, that's just so mean and unkind. But we remained friends for years. And then I hadn't seen them for a few years. And one of them called me up and was like, hey, we're having a reunion. Come hang out. I was like, oh, we would love that. My husband knew them. We had gone to college together. So we had really extended years of relationship. And they called me back a few weeks later and said, actually, we'd prefer you not to come.
Okay.
And I remember that was my turn to have tears about that. But I remember just thinking, oh man, all along, this was actually how your hearts beat. You actually did not have room for people. And so it just made me so angry and so hurt. But I just thought, oh man, this is actually how your hearts have chosen to be. And I actually don't want to meet up with you. And I had not connected all those seasons, because there were years apart between those 2 things happening. But I thought, oh my gosh, that is not who I want to be. Yeah. And so I don't want to be a part of that. I would just be curious, when it happens to us, when we're not the ones that get included, even though looking at the story, I don't want to hang out with those people. What is it that Lisette has to do to say oh yeah, I don't want this, and to not feel oh, well, why don't you want me there, Which I did at first. I mean, I cried some legit tears because I was just oh man, what did I do for you to not want, for you to be so whatever about it that I can't come to this reunion barbecue for pity's sake. But it was a lot of life choices that had happened, and I think they wondered what I thought about them. And I may or may not have said, which is here or there, but it's hard because I was a kid who remembers the day my dad left and was gone. And I remember being an immigrant kid who didn't speak the same language as anyone at school. And I remember being that kid whose lunches, like everybody made fun of my lunches. And I remember just being like, Mom, can you just make me a ham sandwich so I just fit in at lunch? You know,
Yes.
So I think there's something always in me that always has this hard moment when I feel like somebody doesn't want me. And yet, but what do I want to be a part of? And there's this kingdom thing that is so much more beautiful and never makes you feel that way on purpose, for sure.
Yes,
and so
absolutely.
it's like, no, let me choose that. But, you know, I had to honestly wind through all those other feelings first.
Can I ask you about your dad?
Yeah.
How old were you when he was not in your picture anymore of your life?
Yeah. He left when I was 6. I mean, it was the typical custody situation where my mom had custody, but I had to do every other weekend and half a holidays with him. But he was a genuinely unwell human. And so that was the difficult, and I was an only child. So it was this, so many complexities with that, but there was only so much fighting you can do and so much you can keep your kid away from. So the last day I actually saw him was the day after my wedding. That was the last day I ever saw him. So he was connected to my life here and there, but he was very unhealthy, toxic.
When did Jesus become more than just a name for you? Was that early in your childhood or after your dad had left?
It was after. It was my mom got remarried, and I think in the complexities of everything that was life, I mean, her having dealt with, he was emotionally very abusive and then had affairs. So, I mean, she was pretty wrecked. My now stepdad had lost his wife to cancer and gone through a very difficult season. They're both Dutch, which is super funny, and met in Canada. So that's a whole thing. And we had a Norwegian neighbor who loved Jesus. Like, it's such a funny, like, we're like, I swear the dogs did it because everybody walked dogs together. So my mom became a Christian when I was 8 or 9. And then my stepdad followed about a year later. And that's when we started going to church. It was probably 9, 10 when I remember kind of like, oh, this place felt fun. And then it was when I was 13, I went through some really significantly difficult things with my dad. I no longer was staying there anymore, which was good, but it was brutal. And it was in that time that Jesus really became alive to me because I needed the safety and comfort of someone who could see it all and understood it all, even though I didn't know how to talk about a lot of it, and would sit with me in that. I saw that in the face of my youth pastor who continuously pointed me to Jesus. And so I would say that's when it felt like Jesus really became alive to me.
Was it hard when they're like, God is your father? And you have...
I realize we're on a podcast. Nobody can see my face. I was like, yes.
Like, you're just like, wait, what? Because you have this representation of a father, you have a stepdad, and I'm sure there were other males in your life. And so you're like, okay, but this is what I know as a 13-year-old and maybe even into adulthood, you're still trying to wrestle like, okay, it's kind of like in Narnia, Aslan, is he safe? Can I trust him? And so what was that journey like for you?
It has been ongoing. I think it's part of what has made me really mindful to use the image of Father God with kids, because for so many kids, their fathers are a complicated figure in their life. Sadly, very complicated figure in my life. That has been an ongoing journey for me and a trust journey, I would say. My dad was killed in a crash. It would be 15 years ago now. And so I had to re-engage everything at that point. So we'd been married for about 10 years. He'd never met our kids. So that was like a whole thing. But then I had to re-engage at that point. And I think at that point, actually, because there was some closure to it, God started healing that. And it's been an ongoing thing. But man, when I go through tough seasons, and we've been in a doozy of a one the last couple of years, my trust, like that's the one that has the hardest time. And then I'm like, Jesus, I know you say you're trustworthy. I know you've shown yourself to be trustworthy, but I have a few questions still.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's interesting how you said that the story with Tommy, like that's what like did your heart for the way of justice. But then I see now Lisette at the lunch table wanting the ham sandwich. And like that connects to me of like, that's like how you felt as a child. And you're like, that has just kind of like been this through line for you. And so I think that's just so beautiful how God, even in the brokenness and the messy, he restores and he's like, I'm going to use this girl for justice. Do you like ham sandwiches still?
I do, weirdly. And it's my youngest. It's his favorite, which I think is really sweet. And it makes me smile. And it is funny. But it is like, isn't that the beautiful way of it, though? You just realize like how God winds this story through us. And it's story after story in this bigger story of this beautiful like redemption journey where God really does restore and make things beautiful that have felt very broken and hard and messy. So what a gift. What a gift. Even down to ham sandwiches, which I still like.
Absolutely.
Listen.
You mentioned like, you know, it's an ongoing trust journey. When we think about like our lives going into the future, like that's hard, or we can kind of like hold on to it and be like, oh, yeah, like, I'm going to trust you. For somebody who's kind of walking through a season where it's just like, I don't know, either we forget about what God has done in the past, or just like, you know, it's just really challenging to see that hope on the other side. What would be your top 3 ways? And I know this is going to be different for everybody, but like, hey, this is how we can continue to hold on to hope and to trust that God is going to walk through all of these stories with us.
I mean, I guess a couple things. Like one is like the classic line of check the receipts. Like there's been so much, you know, in the past where I can go, man, God has been so faithful. So I know that to be true. I might not feel it right in this moment, but I know that to be true historically. I think so, checking my own receipts for that, so to speak, but also being with other people of faith. Like when you're doubting, like there's nothing more helpful than somebody else going, but I just experienced and I know this to be true. It's part of what helps us get through all kinds of stages of life, right? Where you're like, oh, but I know this to be true. And you're like, well, if you know it and I trust you because I see you right now, then I can believe that. I think there's also just a side that I feel like time has such an ebb and flow. And so trying to say like, well, this too shall pass. We repeat that a lot in our house because sometimes you just need to know like this little season will end and we'll get to a new one, and you see things differently when you get through whatever. I think the other is we're so quick to put everything in a strict binary. So you're either trustworthy or you're not trustworthy. And maybe that's not actually fair. Maybe it's you're trustworthy and this situation is complicated, you know? And so rarely is anything quite as one or the other. And so sometimes I just need to remind myself it's not one or the other.
I'm working with a friend and her organization. They do these beautiful events. And right now their theme for this month is hope. And just kind of seeing, sometimes when we think of hope, it seems so expansive, so big. But really, sometimes it is these like little moments where we can see God just like showing up. Maybe like just because, I don't know, it's a ham sandwich that day, or it's a rainbow outside when there shouldn't even be a rainbow outside. So I'd love to know, is there anything like within the last like couple of months that you're like, oh yeah, like I was in a moment and like this happened and I knew that was only God?
For real, anytime I'm at the ocean, if I see dolphins, that's such a thing for me. So the way you said rainbow, like immediately I saw the dolphin. Like we had this day, we were at the beach. There's just been a lot. And it was like this moment where I saw this dolphin just jump out of the water. And I was like, oh, Jesus, there's no reason that I should necessarily see this from where I'm standing today. But I did. And it was the most beautiful, lovely, like, I mean, they're just stunning. But there was something about that was just God's reminder of like, nope. I haven't forgotten. I'm not missing any of this. And yeah, it just felt like one of those little like holy kisses, right? Where you're like, oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. That's so lovely. I liked how you said that. Like, I shouldn't be seeing this from where I'm standing. And just to know that sometimes it feels like there's just a tornado around us. But out of we just see that little glimmer of that little spark that just reminds us like, I'm with you. I am walking alongside you each and every step of the way. Just wrapping up. It is summertime. I know you said you try to go to the beach Your son will be home. Anything else that you're like, this Californian summer, this is what this family is about.
This family is about, listen, that beach life is so real. It just makes the world a lovely place. I think I spent so much of my life around snow that I'm just like, beach is beautiful. And barbecuing, just a lot of grilling. If I could be outside all day, eat outside, work outside, be outside. Glory.
And that's how you know you live in California. The Midwest, not so much.
But that's, like I said, I grew up in Canada. Like, we grew up with like a lot of weather.
I would love to be outside every single day if the weather allows it.
I mean, come on for a visit anytime.
That is the one thing about this podcast. I'm like, where can I go? That like maybe we could just stop by and say, hey, what's up?
Absolutely.
Oh, well, Lisette, thank you so much for walking us back to that summer camp and hearing about Tommy's story and knowing that really awakened this heart of justice inside you, and just what God is continuing to do. And just thank you so much for taking the time and being on the Parable Podcast.
Gosh, thank you for having me. Thank you for asking. And what a wonderful way to imagine what God is up to and what the world is up to is to learn from our stories. So thank you.
Wherever you are this summer season, I hope, just like Lisette, you are finding a place to enjoy the outdoors and the people you love in your life. To connect with Lisette, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with her today. Number 1, what has God placed on your heart the most? Maybe it is justice or serving or kindness or creativity, loving others well. What is that for you currently in this season? Number 2, is there something right now that you need to trust God with and hand it over to Him? And maybe that is even as you pray, you're physically extending your hands as a prayer, saying, God, I am giving this over to you. Just a hint, I've done this before and it's all day. It's a constant release because we are learning over and over to give things to Him. If you like Lisette's episode, a great compliment to hers would be checking out my friend Kelsey's episode, number 87, called Trusting Life's Curveballs. Also, thanks to my fantastic producer of a husband, Eric, for making us sound so great. That's going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God pursues justice and kindness for all. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.